Welcome, welcome, welcome to the deep dive. Okay, so if you're a student in Mr. A's world history class, you probably know that feeling, that little flutter in your stomach just before a big test.
Uh-huh.
Unit 1, the rise of modern political thought. It's here, and yeah, those short answer and essay questions can look pretty daunting.
They really can.
Well, think of this as your ultimate study hack. Our goal today isn't just spitting facts back at you. We want to give you that deep understanding, those critical connections you're going to need to really ace those questions.
That's exactly right. We're aiming to go way beyond just memorization here.
Mhm.
Our mission is to really unpack the core ideas, the key figures, and the crucial historical events of Unit 1. And we'll be tackling those big central historical questions Mr. A always emphasizes.
Right, like how have historical events revealed both the persistent challenge to an evolving progress and the universal recognition of human rights? We're going to see how these ideas about human dignity, well, they've been tested, challenged, and sometimes very slowly, painfully moved forward.
Yeah, it's not always a straight line. And then there's the scientific revolution. How did it fundamentally reshape humanity's understanding of the natural world and the very methods of acquiring knowledge?
It's a huge one. Thinking about how a shift in understanding the stars actually impacts how we think about ourselves, our place in everything.
Exactly. And then we'll zoom into 17th century England, a real pressure cooker of ideas. How did those political conflicts and philosophical debates, especially the really different ideas of Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, lead to the development of foundational democratic concepts?
And we can't talk about universal rights without asking this. What were the opportunities and limitations for women working in the sciences during the 17th and 18th centuries?
A critical question, definitely. And of course, we have to tackle two of Mr. A's classic questions that, they need some real nuanced answers. Was Galileo really a heretic?
Always a good one.
And was the English Revolution of 1688 actually glorious?
Okay, so the real power here for you, listening in and prepping for that exam, is seeing how all these seemingly separate things, science, politics, philosophy, social norms, human rights, they're all tangled up
Oh,
together.
totally interconnected.
When you connect those dots, that's when you really show Mr. A you've got a sophisticated understanding. We're going to give you the evidence, the analysis, the arguments you need for those top-tier responses. So let's dive in.
Let's do it.
So let's start by looking up at the cosmos and this really transformative period, the scientific revolution. Before this big shift happened, how did people generally figure things out about the natural world? What was the accepted way of knowing?
Well, I forget the scientific revolution kicked off. The main source of knowledge was really ancient authorities,
Yeah.
particularly Aristotle, the Greek philosopher. His ideas had pretty much dominated Western thought for centuries. Medieval scholars, early scientists, they didn't typically prioritize, direct observation or
Yeah.
experimenting with the world around them.
Really? So they weren't like running tests?
Not in the way we think of it now. Scientific inquiry mostly involved carefully reading and interpreting old texts from antiquity. It was sort of like believing all the answers were already written down. You just had to find them in these old books. Tradition, ancient wisdom, religious authority that held immense weight. Unquestioned, really.
That sounds pretty rigid. Like
Yeah.
knowledge was just stuck. So what changed? What sparked the shift? What pushed people to start questioning things?
It was really a convergence of several factors, kind of a perfect storm. First, you had the Renaissance humanists. They were rediscovering and mastering a wider range of Greek and Latin texts. And in doing so, they found works by people like Archimedes and Plato thinkers who actually disagreed with Aristotle on certain points.
Ah, so they found contradictions within the accepted ancient wisdom.
Exactly. That wasn't just finding new information. It was finding that the supposedly infallible ancient authorities didn't always agree. That created a crack in the foundation. It was like discovering the rule book had conflicting rules.
Okay, that makes sense. Finding inconsistencies in the old ways. What else was going on?
Well, beyond the texts, there were practical technical problems demanding new approaches. Think about the age of exploration. Sailors needed better navigation, needed to calculate ship weights accurately. Engineers needed to understand mechanics for new inventions. These real-world challenges forced a more empirical approach. You had to observe, measure, calculate precisely.
Right. Necessity being the mother of invention, or in this case, observation.
Precisely. And then, of course, you had the invention of new instruments. The telescope, suddenly you could see the heavens like never before. And the microscope, revealing a whole hidden world of the very small. These tools opened up completely new realms for discovery, forcing people to trust what they were seeing.
Things Aristotle could never have seen.
Exactly. And finally, don't forget the printing press. invented earlier, but now it was really kicking into high gear.
Yeah.
It allowed these new ideas, these observations, these challenges to tradition to spread rapidly across Europe. It massively accelerated intellectual exchange and debate, like an early internet, really.
So it sounds like a powerful mix. Rediscovered texts showing contradictions, real-world problems needing solutions, amazing new tools for observation, and the means to spread ideas quickly. All this came together to fundamentally change how people understood the world and, maybe more importantly, how they even thought about acquiring knowledge.
Absolutely. It was a huge paradigm shift.
Yeah.
Moving from what did Aristotle say?
Yeah.
To what do my own eyes, my own experiments tell me?
Yeah.
And that new way of thinking, that emphasis on reason and evidence, wasn't just going to stay confined to science. It laid the groundwork for questioning everything.
Okay, so with this shift underway, we see these revolutionary thinkers emerge. Individuals who really dared to look at the universe differently. Let's start with Nicholas Copernicus. He quite literally moved the Earth, didn't he? What was his big disruptive idea?
Copernicus is foundational, absolutely. And his idea was cosmic dynamite. He proposed the heliocentric model, the idea that the Earth and the other planets revolve around the sun. This flew directly in the face of the geocentric view, Earth at the center, which had been accepted for, well, thousands of years. It was embedded in science, philosophy, theology, everything.
And he published this right at the end of his life, right, in 1543.
Yes, De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium on the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres. Published the year he died, which some think was maybe intentional, to avoid the immediate backlash.
Smart move, perhaps? What was the impact, even if his model wasn't perfect initially?
Well, you're right. His model still used circular orbits, which wasn't quite accurate. Kepler would fix that later. But its impact was profound. It laid the essential groundwork for modern astronomy. Copernicus didn't just shift the Earth's position. He shifted humanity's place in the cosmos. Think about it. Suddenly, we weren't the center of everything. We were just another planet. That was a huge psychological and intellectual adjustment. It truly kicked off a paradigm shift, encouraging others to question all established beliefs. It demanded evidence.
So Copernicus opens the door, and then Johannes Kepler comes along and provides the mathematical muscle. How did he build on Copernicus's work?
Kepler's contribution was crucial for giving the heliocentric model mathematical precision. He used incredibly detailed observational data, much of it from Tycho Brahe, to show that planets don't move in perfect circles, but in elliptical orbits. That was a major breakthrough in accuracy. He formulated 3 laws of planetary motion, the law of orbits, areas, and harmonies. These weren't just guesses. They were precise mathematical descriptions of how the heavens worked.
So he turned astronomy into more of a predictive science.
Exactly. It moved from being mostly descriptive to being quantitative and predictive. His work showed the universe operated according to elegant, discoverable mathematical rules, and that heavily influenced scientists like Newton later on.
Which brings us to Galileo Galilei. He's famous for his telescope, and while for getting into some serious trouble, what did he see, and why was it so important?
Galileo's telescopic observations were stunning, and they provided powerful visual proof for heliocentrism. He saw moons orbiting Jupiter, clear evidence that not everything circled the Earth. He observed the phases of Venus, which only made sense if Venus orbited the sun. He saw sunspots, challenging the idea of perfect, unchanging heavens. He even saw mountains and valleys on the moon, making it seem much more Earth-like.
Real, empirical evidence backing up Copernicus and Kepler.
Absolutely. But his outspoken support for the Copernican model put him on a collision course with the Church. It led to charges of heresy, his trial by the Inquisition, and his book, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, being banned. That conflict, as we'll discuss more, is absolutely central to understanding this clash between new science and old authority and what it meant for intellectual freedom. Really important for your exam prep.
Definitely. And then Isaac Newton. He seems like the figure who pulled it all together, unifying the physical world.
Newton's work was just monumental, a true game changer. His book, Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, or just the Principia, published in 1687, was like a blueprint for the physical universe. He laid out his 3 laws of motion and, crucially, the law of universal gravitation.
The apple falling from the tree story.
Right, that illustrates the core idea. What was truly revolutionary was that Newton showed the same physical laws applied everywhere, to the apple falling, to the moon orbiting Earth, to the planets orbiting the sun. He unified terrestrial and celestial mechanics into one coherent system.
So no more separate rules for Earth and the heavens.
Exactly. This effectively ended the dominance of Aristotelian physics. Newton promoted a new scientific paradigm based firmly on observation, experimentation, and rigorous mathematical reasoning. His ideas had a massive impact, not just in science, but in philosophy, boosting confidence in human reason and even theology, with many seeing the universe as this grand clockwork mechanism governed by rational laws.
Okay, shifting from the cosmos to the methods of knowing. Francis Bacon is often called a father of the scientific method. What was his big idea?
Bacon was all about empiricism. He strongly emphasized that knowledge comes primarily from sensory experience, from what you can see, touch, measure. Direct observation was key. He believed our minds are prone to errors, biases, he called them idols, that distort our understanding.
Like preconceived notions getting in the way.
Exactly. To combat this, he championed inductive reasoning. That means starting with specific, careful observations and experiments, gathering lots of data points, and then building up to broader general principles or theories. Think of it like constructing something brick by brick from the ground up, based on solid evidence.
So observation first, theory later.
Pretty much. He stressed systematic experimentation and explicitly rejected just relying on tradition or ancient authorities like the scholastics. For Bacon, the goal wasn't just knowing stuff. It was about human improvement, using science to gain new understandings and make practical progress. He really laid out a new methodology.
And then we have René Descartes, the rationalist, approaching it from almost the opposite direction. How did his method differ?
Descartes focused on deductive reasoning. He wanted to start with truths that were absolutely certain, undeniable, and then logically deduce other knowledge from those foundations. His method was radical doubt. Doubt everything your senses, what you've been taught, until you find something you simply cannot doubt.
I think, therefore I am.
Precisely. Cogito, ergo sum. That became his bedrock certainty. The very act of doubting proved he existed as a thinking being. This made individual reason and consciousness the starting point for knowledge, not external authority or potentially deceptive senses. He also proposed Cartesian dualism, the idea that the world is made of two distinct substances: mind, thinking, non-physical, and matter, extended physical.
The mind-body split.
Yes, that fundamental separation, which has had a huge influence on philosophy and how we think about consciousness ever since. So, while Bacon emphasized observation moving up to principles, Descartes emphasized reason moving down from certain principles. Both were crucial in shaping the scientific method, pushing for rigor and challenging old ways of thinking. They put human intellect front and center.
Okay, let's zoom in on that clash we mentioned, Galileo's trial. This is such a critical moment and really connects to that central question about human rights specifically, the right to think freely, to pursue knowledge. So was Galileo really a heretic? Let's trace how this conflict escalated. It's important context for your exam answers.
Right, the tension had been building. Copernicus published his theory in 1543. Then, in 1545, the Council of Trent firmly declared only the Church could interpret the Bible, a key move in the Counter-Reformation against Protestantism. That set a clear boundary. And then a really chilling event. In 1600, Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake for heresy. Part of his alleged heresy was supporting heliocentrism, so the risks were incredibly high.
And Galileo, with his telescope observations starting around 1609, became convinced Copernicus was right, and he wasn't quiet about it.
No, he wasn't. By 1615, the Church officially warned him to stop publicly promoting the theory. Interestingly, around the same time, a friar named Foscarini tried to argue that Copernicus didn't contradict the Bible if you interpreted Scripture metaphorically, but the Church wasn't having it. In 1616, they put Copernicus's book on the Index of Forbidden Books. That was a clear signal. They were digging in their heels.
And the final straw was Galileo's book in 1632.
Yes, his dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. He had thought, perhaps, that the new Pope, Urban VIII, might be more open. But the book came across as a pretty blatant defense of heliocentrism, and it made the geocentric position look, well, rather foolish. That direct challenge led straight to the Inquisition charging him with heresy in 1633.
Let's look at his defense. In his letter to Duchess Christina from 1615, how did he argue his case? What was the main accusation?
The accusation was basically that theologians were using Bible verses like the sun moving in Joshua or the earth standing still in Psalms to claim his heliocentric view was wrong and heretical because the Bible cannot err. Galileo's defense was quite subtle. He didn't deny the Bible's truth, but he argued it's very complex. He suggested its bare words, the literal meaning, might not be the true meaning in all cases, especially when talking about the physical world.
So distinguishing between religious truth and scientific description.
Exactly. He argued God gave us senses, reason, and intellect to figure out the physical world through observation and logic. The Bible's purpose, he said, was guiding souls to salvation, not teaching astronomy. He even questioned whether a scientific view, one not directly about salvation, could be heretical. He was essentially arguing for separating science from literal biblical interpretation regarding nature, a plea for intellectual space.
A powerful argument. But the church, represented by Cardinal Bellarmine in his 1615 letter, saw it very differently. Why did they hold so firmly to the earth-centered view?
Bellarmine's position rested on two main pillars. First, Scripture. He pointed to numerous passages interpreted for centuries by church fathers and writers as saying the sun moves around a stationary earth. He stressed that the Council of Trent forbade interpreting Scripture contrary to this long-held consensus. Second, he appealed to common sense, to everyday experience. He basically said, look, you feel the earth standing still, you see the sun and stars move. So to him, sensory experience seemed to confirm the traditional view.
And what about Galileo's point about non-literal interpretation? That this wasn't really about faith?
Bellarmine rejected that flatly. He argued that denying the literal interpretation of these specific passages, supported by tradition and the Holy Spirit, was just as heretical as denying core doctrines like Jesus' divinity. He essentially said the structure of the universe was a matter of faith because it touched on the literal truth of Scripture, which the Church alone had the authority to interpret. He did concede a tiny point. If there were ever a true demonstration of heliocentrism, the Church might have to reconsider its interpretation. But he firmly believed no such proof existed. His stance was really about defending the Church's absolute authority as interpreters, especially important during the fight against Protestantism. Any concession looked like weakness.
Which ultimately led to the condemnation in 1633. What were the formal charges, and what happened to Galileo?
The charges were stark. The idea that the sun is the center and immovable, declared absurd, philosophically false, and formally heretical because it contradicted Holy Scripture. The idea that the earth moves, also absurd, philosophically false, and at least erroneous in faith. He was condemned for holding the doctrine, sure, but also specifically for explaining the Scriptures according to your own meaning, defying church authority, and supporting an opinion contrary to Scripture. The outcome was tragic. He was forced to publicly recant, to abjure his errors. He spent the rest of his life under house arrest, silenced.
But then much later in 1992, Pope John Paul II revisited the case. What did the Church acknowledge then?
Yes, in a really significant moment, Pope John Paul II acknowledged the Church had erred in condemning Galileo. He explained that the theologians back then had failed to recognize the formal distinction between the Bible and its interpretation. They'd mistakenly treated a scientific question as a matter of faith doctrine. Of course, it was much easier to say this in 1992. Science had long since proven Galileo right. The pressure from Protestantism had changed. It was a recognition that scientific truth and religious truth can coexist if understood in their proper contexts.
So for your exam, this whole Galileo affair is a prime example. It shows the scientific revolution challenging not just ancient science like Aristotle, but deeply embedded traditional beliefs and powerful institutions like the Church. This clash wasn't just about astronomy. It set a precedent for questioning all kinds of authority, including political authority, which feeds directly into the Enlightenment.
Absolutely. Galileo's courageous stand for evidence and reason, despite the risks, symbolizes that broader shift towards questioning established dogma. And that struggle for intellectual freedom is a key theme when you're analyzing the progress and the challenges in human rights history.
Okay, let's shift focus now to a group often sidelined in these big stories of revolution women. The scientific revolution emphasized reason and observation. But how did that translate into opportunities or the lack of them for women in science during the 17th and 18th centuries? This is another great area for your exam, connecting directly to that question about how universal the recognition of human rights really was.
It's a crucial question, absolutely. Because while the intellectual climate was changing, societal norms often lagged way behind. But there were some avenues, some glimpses of opportunity for women. One notable path was through family connections, working alongside a husband, father, or brother who was involved in science. A great example is Elisabetha Hevelius, an astronomer. There are depictions of her actively working with her husband, Johannes, using instruments like a large sextant that often required two people.
So collaboration within the family could open doors.
It could. It provided a way to bypass the formal institutional barriers that usually excluded women. Elisabetha contributed significantly to major projects, like compiling star catalogs, though often the credit primarily went to her husband. Marriage or family ties offered a practical route to direct involvement.
What about women pursuing knowledge more independently or learning indirectly?
Yes, that happened too. Look at Margaret Cavendish, a really fascinating figure, a philosopher, writer, scientist. She wrote about learning extensively from her husband, listening to his edifying discourse, absorbing knowledge through his experiences and conversations. She contrasted herself with wives who just gossiped, saying she preferred to feast with the sciences or discourse with the arts. It shows how private study and intellectual curiosity, often supported by a male figure, could be an avenue. And significantly, she didn't just learn privately, she published her own scientific and philosophical works, like the Philosophical and Physical Opinions in 1655. That was incredibly bold for a woman then.
And she wasn't the only one publishing or achieving major intellectual feats.
No, definitely not. You have Émilie du Châtelet in France, a brilliant physicist and mathematician. She translated Newton's Principia into French, which is a massive undertaking. And she didn't just translate, she added her own extensive commentary, clarifications, and corrections, showing a deep understanding. Later on, Dorothea Schlosser became the first woman to get a PhD from a German university in 1787. An amazing accomplishment against the odds. So the talent and drive were clearly there.
But despite these individual successes, the overall picture seems dominated by limitations and stereotypes. This is where that universal rights idea really gets tested, right? What barriers did women face?
The barriers were formidable and systemic. Discrimination and exclusion from formal institutions were rampant. Take Maria Winkelmann, another skilled astronomer. After her husband died, she sought to continue his work officially at the Berlin Academy work she had already been doing, including discovering a comet. But she was denied the position and even membership. The Academy secretary, Johann Jablonski, explicitly worried the Academy was being ridiculed because a woman prepared his calendar and feared keeping her would cause more mockery.
Wow. So fear of public opinion and prejudice trumped her actual skills.
Absolutely. It reveals this deep societal bias against women in formal scientific roles. These institutional barriers cut women off from resources, collaboration, funding, and official recognition. And even if women did gain access to intellectual circles, their contributions could be dismissed or trivialized.
How so?
Well, consider Samuel Pepys's diary entry after Margaret Cavendish visited the Royal Society. He commented on her antique dress and manners, and then said he did not hear her say anything that was worth hearing. It shows his tendency to judge women on appearance and behavior rather than engaging with their intellect. Their ideas were often just ignored or not taken seriously.
So getting in the room wasn't enough. And even for those who achieved academic success, like Dorothea Schlosser with her PhD, there was pressure to conform to traditional roles.
Immense pressure. Schlosser faced stereotypes that learned women were supposedly neurotic, unfeminine, or socially awkward. The very article celebrating her doctorate felt the need to stress she was also proficient in domestic skills, sewing, knitting, household management. It highlights this exhausting balancing act women had to perform. Prove your intellectual worth, but also prove you're still conforming to traditional gender expectations. Intellectual achievement alone wasn't enough to escape prejudice.
And on top of all these societal and institutional hurdles, there were basic physical realities unique to women at the time.
Yes, and this is often overlooked, but so important. Think back to Émilie du Châtelet working intensely on her Newton translation. She expressed a desperate fear of dying in childbirth before finishing, wanting not to lose the fruit of my labors. In an era of high maternal mortality, pregnancy and childbirth posed very real, life-threatening risks that could abruptly end a woman's intellectual work, a danger their male colleagues simply didn't face in the same way.
So pulling this together for the exam, these experiences clearly show that even during the scientific revolution, with its focus on reason, the idea of universal recognition of human rights was severely limited for women.
Exactly. While the Enlightenment would later talk about rights for all individuals, the reality on the ground, the ingrained norms, the discrimination, the stereotypes women faced even in the supposedly rational field of science reveals a huge, persistent challenge to genuine equality. Progress wasn't uniform across gender lines.
Okay, so from science challenging old ways of knowing, we move into politics and society. The Enlightenment took that spirit of reason and applied it to human life itself. To set the stage, let's quickly define two key terms: absolutism and the Enlightenment. First, absolutism. What exactly is that?
Absolutism is basically a system where one ruler, usually a monarch like a king or queen, holds absolute total power. Think someone like Louis XVI in France, though maybe his grandfather Louis XIV is an even better example. There are no real checks or balances on their power from a parliament, constitution, or the people. Power is centralized entirely in the monarch, and often this power was justified by divine right, the belief that God chose the monarch to rule, so they were accountable only to God, not their subjects.
Total control, justified by God. Got it. Now, how does the Enlightenment contrast with that? What was its core idea?
The Enlightenment basically asked, What if we use reason, the same kind of thinking that revealed laws of physics, to figure out the best way to organize society and government? It was this major intellectual and philosophical movement, mostly in the 18th century, focused on reason, individualism, skepticism towards tradition, and the idea of human rights. Enlightenment thinkers challenged things like divine right, inherited privilege, and rigid social structures. They wanted to improve society, government, and ethics based on rational inquiry and human potential, not just unquestioned dogma.
So our central question here is, how did this Enlightenment movement challenge or reshape that system of absolutism? Seems like a head-on collision. Let's dive into some of the key thinkers. Thomas Hobbes. He had a pretty bleak view of human nature, didn't he? And what did that lead him to believe about government?
Hobbes was definitely a pessimist about humans and their natural state. He believed without a strong ruler, life would be a constant struggle for survival. Solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, as he famously put it, driven by passions and self-interest. To escape this chaos, he argued, people enter a social contract. They agree to give up their freedom to an absolute ruler in exchange for order and security. So while he actually attacked the divine right idea, he thought the ruler's power came from this contract, not God. He still strongly supported absolute monarchy. He believed dividing power would lead to chaos and civil war. The sovereign needed unlimited power to keep the peace.
A tough bargain. Give up freedom for safety. But then John Locke comes along with a much more optimistic view, especially about rights. What were his core ideas?
Locke offered a radically different perspective. He believed people had natural rights even before government existed, rights inherent to being human. The key ones were life, liberty, and property. These rights weren't granted by rulers. They were natural, inalienable. For Locke, the whole purpose of government was to protect these natural rights. People consented to be governed to secure their rights.
And what if the government failed to do that, or violated those rights?
This is crucial. Locke argued that if the government broke the social contract, if it became tyrannical and violated natural rights, that people had the right to resist and even overthrow that government, the right to revolution. He argued against absolute rule, favoring a limited government, maybe a limited monarchy or republic, where power derived from law and the consent of the governed. His ideas were hugely influential, especially for the American founders.
A massive shift power ultimately resides with the people. Okay, next up, Montesquieu. He focused on the structure of government itself.
Yes, Montesquieu's big contribution was the idea of the separation of powers. In his work, The Spirit of the Laws, he argued that government power should be divided into distinct branches: legislative, making laws; executive, enforcing laws; and judiciary, interpreting laws.
Why divide them? What was the danger of combining them?
He believed concentrating all power in one person or body inevitably led to tyranny. If the same entity made the laws, enforced them, and judged breaches of them, there'd be no check on abuse, threatening liberty. By separating powers, each branch could act as a check on the others, creating a balance and preventing any one part from becoming too dominant. He favored a constitutional monarchy that incorporated this separation, hugely influential on constitutional design worldwide.
Makes sense. Checks and balances. Then there's Voltaire, known for his sharp wit and focus on tolerance.
Voltaire was a fierce advocate for civil liberties, especially freedom of speech and religious toleration. He relentlessly attacked intolerance, superstition, and abuses of power by both the state and the church. He famously used satire and essays to expose injustice. His famous line, often paraphrased, is about defending to the death someone's right to say something, even if you disagree with it. Like many others, he generally favored a constitutional monarchy as the best way to protect these freedoms from arbitrary power.
Moving on to Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He introduced this idea of the general will. What did he mean by that?
Rousseau's ideas are complex but very influential. He talked about the social compact, where individuals agree to form a society. Part of this compact, for Rousseau, involves subordinating one's individual desires or natural liberty to the general will. The general will wasn't just the sum of everyone's private interests. It was the collective good, the common interest of the community as a whole. Think of it as what's best for everyone, even if it clashes with what I want right now.
So individual will versus the collective good.
Sort of. For Rousseau, true freedom came from participating in and obeying this general will, because it represented the collective sovereignty of the people. He was a strong advocate for direct democracy, where citizens themselves make the laws, ensuring the general will prevails.
And finally, Adam Smith. He applied Enlightenment ideas to economics. The invisible hand.
Yes, Adam Smith, in his hugely important book, The Wealth of Nations, argued for economic liberty. He believed that individuals pursuing their own economic self-interest in a free market unintentionally benefit society as a whole. It's like an invisible hand, guides resources to their most productive use, leading to greater overall wealth and welfare. Therefore, he advocated for laissez-faire, minimal government interference in the economy. Let the market operate freely. This was a radical challenge to the mercantilist ideas of the time, which favored heavy government control.
Okay, so looking at all these thinkers for your exam, you can see a clear pattern. Building on the scientific revolution's use of reason, they directly attacked the foundations of absolutism.
Absolutely. They promoted ideas like natural rights, government by consent, separation of powers, individual liberties, the general will, economic freedom. It fundamentally shifted the perceived source of legitimate political power from God or the monarch to the people.
Yeah.
This reshaped political thought and pushed forward the concept of human rights.
Now, here's an interesting twist. Enlightened absolutism. We've seen how the Enlightenment challenged absolute rule, but some absolute rulers actually adopted Enlightenment ideas. How did that work? Was it genuine change or just a way to hold on to power?
It's a really fascinating phenomenon and definitely a bit of a contradiction. Enlightened absolutism refers to 18th century monarchs who kept their absolute power but did implement reforms inspired by the Enlightenment. They might improve administration, promote religious toleration, codify laws, support education or the arts, foster economic growth, things Enlightenment thinkers advocated for. However, and this is the crucial point for your analysis, they almost never proposed reforms that would actually undermine their own absolute authority or fundamentally change the social structure that supported them.
So it was like using Enlightenment tools to make their absolute rule more efficient or stable, but not to actually give up power.
Exactly. It was often more about state building and modernization than about truly embracing popular sovereignty or universal rights. Pragmatism often outweighed ideology. Let's look at some examples.
Okay, Frederick the Great of Prussia, what did he do and where were the limits?
Frederick the Great definitely saw himself as enlightened, calling himself the first servant of the state. He did quite a bit. Granted religious freedom, improved schools, reformed the justice system, outlawed torture, promoted officials based on merit, all progressive moves. But the limits were clear. He made no real effort to end serfdom, which kept the majority of his population unfree and tied to the land. And the tax system still heavily favored the nobility. So he modernized the state apparatus, but preserved the core social hierarchy and his own ultimate power.
What about Joseph II of Austria? He seemed more radical.
Joseph II was probably the most genuinely committed to Enlightenment ideals among the monarchs. He pushed for religious toleration for Protestants and Jews, tried to bring the Catholic Church under state control, and most dramatically, he abolished serfdom entirely. He even tried to make the tax system fairer. These were huge changes. But his reforms often met massive resistance from the nobles and the church, and even from peasants unused to the changes. Many of his reforms were actually reversed after his death, showing how fragile reforms were when they depended solely on the monarch's will and lacked broader support or institutional change.
And Catherine the Great of Russia, she corresponded with Voltaire, aimed to modernize Russia.
Catherine was very savvy about projecting an enlightened image. She did things like expanding education, including for girls, easing censorship initially, restricting torture, and promoting economic development. She convened a commission to create a new legal code, though it didn't ultimately succeed. But her limitations were also stark. She relied heavily on the nobility, so real administrative reform was limited. And crucially, after a massive peasant uprising, Pugachev's rebellion, she actually strengthened serfdom and gave nobles more power over their serfs. Any move towards peasant rights was completely abandoned when it threatened stability and her hold on power.
So these examples are really important for your exam essays. They show the complex, often contradictory way the Enlightenment spread.
Right. Rulers adopted some ideas, maybe for efficiency, maybe out of genuine belief, but they drew a clear line when it came to their own absolute power or the fundamental social order. It highlights that persistent challenge aspect. Even with these powerful new ideas about rights and reason, entrenched power structures were incredibly resistant to fundamental change. Progress was happening, but it was often partial and compromised.
Okay, let's shift now to England in the 17th century, a period of intense conflict and revolution that laid some really important groundwork for later democratic ideas. What was the core conflict about?
The central struggle throughout much of 17th century England was about who held ultimate power, the king or parliament. The Stuart monarchs, James I and Charles I, strongly believed in the divine right of kings that their authority came directly from God and was absolute. This clashed dramatically with Parliament, which was asserting its own rights and powers, particularly over taxation and lawmaking. It also alienated many people, especially Puritans, who sought religious and political reforms.
And this tension eventually exploded into civil war.
Yes, the English Civil Wars, 1642 to 1651, pitted the Royalists, Cavaliers, against the Parliamentarians, Roundheads. Parliament ultimately won, and this led to something truly shocking for the time. King Charles I was put on trial by Parliament and executed for treason in 1649. This was a radical challenge to the whole idea of monarchy. England then had a period without a king, the Commonwealth, led for much of the time by Oliver Cromwell.
But the monarchy did return.
It did. The Restoration happened in 1660, bringing Charles II, Charles III's son, back to the throne. But the underlying tensions about power and religion didn't disappear. When Charles II's brother, James II, became king in 1685, things came to a head again. James was openly Catholic, and his attempts to promote Catholicism and rule more absolutely revived fears of tyranny. The breaking point for many powerful Protestants came in June 1688, when James's wife gave birth to a son, a Catholic heir, raising the prospect of a permanent Catholic dynasty. That spurred them into action.
Which leads us directly to the Glorious Revolution of 1688. What actually happened, and why is it often called glorious and bloodless?
Facing the prospect of a Catholic succession, a group of influential English political and religious leaders secretly invited William of Orange, a Protestant prince from the Netherlands who was married to James II's Protestant daughter Mary, to bring an army to England. William landed in November 1688. James II found his support collapsing, his army deserting, and he chose to flee to France in December. With James gone, Parliament declared the throne vacant and offered it jointly to William and Mary in February 1689. The reason it's often called glorious or bloodless is that this transfer of power in England itself happened with relatively little fighting, especially compared to the earlier civil wars. Textbooks and historians like G.M. Trevelyan emphasize this lack of large-scale violence in England as its key achievement, a settlement by consent.
Okay, we'll definitely challenge that bloodless idea in a moment.
Yeah.
But first, the major outcome, the English Bill of Rights in 1689. How did this document change the balance of power and protect rights? This is crucial evidence for your exams.
The English Bill of Rights is absolutely fundamental. It decisively shifted power from the monarch to Parliament and established key principles of limited government. It stated clearly that the monarch could not suspend laws, levy taxes, or maintain an army without Parliament's consent. Parliament had to meet regularly. It guaranteed free elections to Parliament and freedom of speech within Parliament. Legislators couldn't be prosecuted for things said during debates. That's huge for legislative independence.
And what about rights for ordinary people?
It included important protections. It affirmed the right of Protestant subjects to bear arms for self-defense. It prohibited excessive bail and fines and outlawed cruel and unusual punishments. So it significantly limited the monarch's power, established parliamentary supremacy, and outlined specific legal protections against arbitrary government action. It put into practice many of the ideas Locke had written about. It's a cornerstone of constitutionalism.
All right, now let's dig deeper, which is what you need to do for those higher marks on the exam. Was this revolution truly glorious for everyone? The traditional story emphasizes consensus and lack of bloodshed in England. But modern historians paint a more complex picture. Edward Vallance, for instance.
Vallance acknowledges the relative lack of fighting in England, but calls the purely bloodless narrative a mythology. He argues it glosses over the fact that William arrived with a foreign army. More importantly, he stresses that in James II's other kingdoms, Ireland and Scotland, the revolution unleashed terrible violence. In Ireland, it led to the brutal Williamite War, culminating in battles like the Boyne, huge loss of life, and the imposition of harsh penal laws against Catholics that lasted for centuries. In Scotland, it sparked Jacobite uprisings and violent clan conflicts. So glorious and bloodless certainly didn't apply across the board, especially if you weren't an English Protestant.
And Stephen Pincus goes even further, rejecting the bloodless and consensual view entirely.
Pincus argues forcefully that it was none of these things. He details significant violence within England itself: riots, attacks on property, especially Catholic chapels and homes, intimidation, and widespread fear. He compares the scale of violence against property and persons and the level of fear to periods of the French Revolution. While not a full-blown civil war, he argues many ordinary English people experienced or feared violence. He believes the bloodless narrative was constructed later to make the revolution seem uniquely moderate and consensual, ignoring the real disruption and coercion involved. This was not a tame event, he concludes.
So, beyond the question of violence, who actually benefited most, Jeremy Corbyn, in a 1988 speech, offered a very critical perspective.
Corbin viewed the revolution primarily through a socioeconomic lens. He argued it was essentially about consolidating the power of the wealthy landowning classes and entrenching discrimination against Catholics. He saw William and Mary's installation not as a popular move, but as something that soothed the landowning classes, a maneuver by the elite to secure their own power and property interests rather than a victory for universal rights.
But Margaret Thatcher, in the same year, presented a very different, much more positive view.
Thatcher saw the Glorious Revolution as a foundational moment for establishing core British values. Tolerance, though we need to qualify that, respect for law, impartial justice, and respect for private property. She credited it with setting Britain on a path of stable evolutionary progress towards parliamentary democracy and universal suffrage, arguing it saved Britain from the violent upheavals seen on the continent. For her, it was a triumph of pragmatic, moderate reform that secured liberty and stability.
However, looking closely at the Bill of Rights itself, that clause limiting the right to bear arms specifically to Protestants is a stark reminder that these liberties weren't universal. Catholics were explicitly excluded and faced discrimination.
Absolutely. That detail is crucial evidence for your analysis. It shows the limits of the progress.
So, for your exam summary, the Glorious Revelation and Bill of Rights were vital steps towards limited government and rule of law, reflecting Locke's ideas. But T, a nuanced view, reveals significant violence, especially outside England, and it primarily benefited the Protestant elite while actively discriminating against Catholics.
Right. It powerfully illustrates both the evolving progress and the persistent challenges in achieving universal human rights. It wasn't glorious for everyone.
And the impact beyond England.
Huge. These events, especially Locke's ideas seemingly validated by the outcome, provided a powerful model and intellectual justification for challenging absolutism elsewhere. They directly inspired later movements, particularly the American Revolution, with its echoes of consent of the governed and the right to alter or abolish government.
Well, that brings us to the end of this pretty intensive deep dive into Unit 1 for Mr. A's class. We've covered a lot of ground, from the scientific revolution, cracking open old ways of knowing with reason and observation,
Yeah, demanding evidence over just accepting authority.
to the Enlightenment, applying that same spirit to challenge ideas about government, rights, and society itself.
We saw thinkers like Copernicus and Galileo changing our view of the cosmos, and then Locke, Montesquieu, Rousseau challenging the power of kings.
And we also looked at the complexities, the messiness of it all, like Galileo's trial showing the fight for intellectual freedom.
Or the significant barriers women faced in science, reminding us that progress wasn't evenly shared.
And things like enlightened absolutism or the differing views on the Glorious Revolution show that history isn't a simple story. There's progress, yes, but also compromise, exclusion, and persistent challenges to making rights truly universal.
Absolutely. That unevenness, those contradictions, that's key for your analysis on the exam.
Right. Remember to connect the dots. How did challenging scientific authority pave the way for questioning political authority?
Contrast Hobbes's fear of chaos demanding absolute rule with Locke's vision of natural rights and government by consent. See how those ideas played out.
And keep using that human rights lens. Who benefited from these changes? Who was left behind? Why? Those persistent challenges versus the evolving progress, that's your framework for strong answers.
Exactly. This rise of modern political thought wasn't sudden. It was a complex, often difficult evolution. Understanding the challenges, the brilliant thinkers, and the ongoing struggles helps you grasp not just the past, but the foundations of the world we're in now.
So keep questioning, keep connecting the evidence. You've got the tools now to really tackle that Unit 1 exam. You've got this.